Hello and welcome everyone for this session on Gen Z, especially uh, uh, conducted by the HR Forum of SLASCOM. Welcome all of you and thank you very much for taking your time with your busy schedules and joining from wherever you are in Sri Lanka, and in fact we have some international participants as well wherever you are in the world. Welcome. So it's great to introduce one of my good friends and also a great speaker today who have with us to share his knowledge on Gen Z, one of the biggest workforce groups going to be, actually they are already in the workplaces. So it's a timely topic, I would say, and also uh, it's a challenging workforce to a certain extent, because some of the managers are coming from different generations. How you can manage, how to manage these generations is a bit of a tricky question sometimes. So without a further ado, let me introduce Nikhil. He's a TED speaker and also a author of best-selling book Target Gen Z, Your Guide to Understanding Gen Z Mindset for Brands, Work Life, and more. So, and also he is a learning and development professional and also a leader with 25 experience uh, in learning management and also lecturing in so many advisory roles. So he has worked between US and Asia with global and regional firms. Also, he is a consultant on high-end leadership development programs and talent solutions. So currently, he is actually the founder of Learn Wisely, which is a premier learning and performance solutions provider. And also before that, he was the managing director of Duke CE India till 2018 as a part of the Duke CE Asian practice. I think Duke CE, one of the leading customized executive education services providers in the world. So they were ranked for consecutive 13 years as the #1 services provider in customized executive education. So he has quite a lot of experience working with businesses as well as advising clients and delivering learning engagement. So before joining Duke CE, he was in advisory role in financial services, mainly in American Express and Franklin Templeton, and so on. So without further ado, let me invite Nikhil. Over to you.
Thank you, Nuwan, and a good afternoon to every one of you. A very good afternoon, a good evening, morning, depending upon which part of the world you're joining in. First things first, just to make sure that my audio is coming clear, if I can get a virtual thumbs up, just to make sure that it's working, and therefore we're good to go. So we're seeing thumbs ups coming up, excellent. And you can also use the chat. So I am very happy. It's on a Friday afternoon, and I'm very humbled to see such a very good turnout on a topic which has so much curiosity. I am a parent of 2 Gen Z boys, and I'm still trying to figure out, even though I'm here trying to give you some tips and advice of what to do when it comes to Gen Z. But it's a generation which is unique, and I think all of you who are in the business where you have to manage teams with either Gen Ys or Gen Zs, I'm sure you're learning new things, as are the Gen Zs themselves when they think about going to work, right? So we'll spend the next 60 minutes, a little more if as required, to give you a little bit of kind of an overview of what is going on in the minds of this generation called Gen Z. But even before we talk about Gen Z, I think we want to spend a little bit of time first helping you understand just a little bit, to be familiar with the different generations, why it's important to know what's the context in which they behave the way they do, right? And then we'll focus exclusively on Gen Z from an employer perspective, from an employee perspective, right? What is their expectation? So if you have a team, or if you're going to recruit some Gen Zs, right, what can you keep in mind? So that'll be our endeavor. I've tried to make this very interactive. And so that you're not going to hear me lecture all the time for the next 60 minutes, we'll have some fun questions. And the mode for our delivery would be to use chat, because we have a fairly large turnout. And the way we're going to do is I'm going to use maybe the next 45, 50 minutes to give you the basic content that I have. And of course, at the end of that, we'll leave whatever time that we need to ask any burning questions you may have, or any curious questions about Gen Z. Even though we're slated to be here for an hour, I'll definitely kind of be around a little post the 4:30 time. So make sure that I can help answer questions for those who have some. Okay. So with that, let me get underway, and I'm going to quickly get to our slide deck. Here we are. All right. Okay, so just as we get underway, quick housekeeping rules to make sure that everyone gets a good learning experience. And here we go. It's basic, just the online protocol that we normally follow, that will keep you on mute just to minimize any background noise. There will be some fun poll questions that I'm going to be asking. So as you think about them, just do respond. If you have any questions, I think the best way would be to put it in the chat, okay? And as you speak, when we get to the end, do ensure that if you can keep any background noise to the minimum, just so that we're able to hear you. And the other ways to communicate during the webinar, of course, is you can use the raise your hand icon button, thumbs up, and so on, right? If in the process, if there is some bandwidth issue on your end, or you get disconnected, just dial back in, we'll be here. And if something happens on our side, we'll do the same, right? Okay, so with that said, let's get underway. I'm going to begin my talk by a few fun questions. So what you will see over the next few slides are some questions, and I'd like you to respond to them in the chat. Okay, so here they are. And just before we get to that, here's our agenda. The agenda is basically going to help you look at what is the generational landscape, right? So we hear terms like baby boomer, silent generation, the traditionalist, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z. There's one more that's come up after Gen Z as well. It's called Gen Alpha. So we'll help you clarify some of that very quickly. Then we look at what does Gen Z look for from an employer, right? And you know, if you are the boss, or if you are a recruiter, or if you're a company, as no one was saying, there's a large part of our demographics around the world, and certainly here in Asia, in Sri Lanka, in India, in Southeast Asia, over the next 15, 20 years, we'll see many of the Gen Z population coming into the workforce, right? So there'll be a huge part of the workforce, right? We often think to say that it's the Gen Ys, but the Gen Ys are now already kind of 20 years into the workforce, right? So the oldest Gen Y, or the millennial, will be around the early 40s. So we'll talk more on Gen Z and what's their employer expectation. And finally, the core of the content is going to focus on, okay, how can I bridge this gap of understanding this particular generation? What are some of my leadership engagement strategies, right? So what can I do as a boss, as a leader? And so that's what. And then, of course, we'll leave some questions, Q&A time in the very end. Okay. So let me begin by some really fun question. And this is, of course, to just help you, just to help understand who all are in our webinar today. And just to help you understand, you know, what the definitions are, I'm saying that which generation do you belong to, right? So if you are a baby boomer, you would have been born between 1946 to 64. If you're a Gen X, between 65 to 79. Millennial would be 1980 to 1995. And of course, Gen Z is 96 to 2012. So just go ahead and put that in the chat. So we'll get a quick idea of what's the diversity of our group itself. And you know, that'll also be good for us to see when we have questions, that who's posing the question, what's their question, and what's the response. If it's you know, a Gen Z or a question coming from Gen Z. And we see the chat is going crazy with all the responses. All right, so I think we see just about every generation, to be fair. I think hard for us to take a poll now, but I see some people with A's, that's baby boomers, some with B, Gen X, Gen Y, and of course Gen Z. Okay, so thank you for that. So I think we've got a very good mix in this workshop or in this webinar, so which is great. All right, now my next question. When you were to grow up, what did you want to become, right? Did you want to become a doctor, a chartered accountant, or an engineer? Do you want to become an entrepreneur, a celebrity, a politician, or other? Okay. And again, I'm sure as you think about these responses, they will be driven by the time in which you were born and the time in which you grew up. So let's see some answers. All right, let's see here. Most of you are saying that, okay, yeah, a doctor or an engineer, but many of you are saying politician or other. Okay, somehow you are saying that, okay, I would like to be doctor, engineer, or entrepreneur. Some of you are saying teacher. Okay, again, wow. So we're seeing a very mixed responses, and that's absolutely fine because that's what we want. Psychiatrists, look at that. So there are choices. I mean, from the 4 choices, of course, if you don't see something on there, you can actually tell us what is it that you want it to be. All right, so keep that in mind. Now, one more question. What was the first thing my generation wanted to buy, right? So think about when you were growing up, what is it that you were wanting to buy? Was it a home? Was it a car? Was it a PC? Or did you wanted to buy a company? All right, and look at the answers. All right, there we go, here we go. Okay, C, D, C. Okay, so which means some of you are saying it's car, it's a PC. Many of you are saying a company. Wow, very unusual. I mean, that's good to see. Okay, lots of you are saying a car. Many of you are saying homes. Okay, many of you are saying a PC. All right, so it's a fairly mixed set of responses again, no problem. Thank you for that. Okay, one more question. What was your favorite childhood drink when you were growing up? And I took the liberty to put a drink which was my favorite when I was growing up here in India, which was Thumbs Up. But what did you like? Did you want it Pepsi? Did you want Coke? Did you want Starbucks? Or did you want something else? And you can respond to that, and let's see the responses. All right, look at that. D, other. So maybe you can tell us what was it. Okay, so we're seeing things like Coke, Milo. All right, thank you for that. Sri Lanka produces some of the best tea. So maybe if you wanted to drink tea as you were growing up, cream soda, look at that, Pepsi. Okay, all right, so no problem. So that's fine. So a lot of you are saying D, the other, yogurt drink, Necto. Excellent. Tea. All right, there we go. We're finally seeing tea, Highlands milk, cream soda. Okay, so fantastic. All right. One more. And the question is that if you were in trouble, when you got in trouble, what would your mothers do, right? Would your mother say to you that, okay, you better wait till your father comes home? Or you know what, I'm going to ground you or lock you in that room. Or you got a tight slap on your face if your mother was like really mad, okay? Or D, which says that, you know what, she ignored it, she went online, got a self-help book, or E. All right, let me see the responses on this one. Okay, a lot of you are saying that, okay, D, all right, many of you are seeing C, many of you are seeing A and B. Okay, I'm seeing lots of D, C, E. Okay, wow. All right. So again, a very mixed bag. So I'm seeing the whole sort of responses. No problem. So thank you for that. And then last one question. Okay, when we think about brothers and sisters in your generation, what can you say? Did you play with them? And they helped you do the chores? When you think about your brothers and sisters, they were fun until I became a teenager, and then you did your thing and he or she did his thing. You both were so busy after a time that you only saw you once in a year. And now the question is, which of your brothers and sisters are your real brothers or your stepbrothers? Okay, so that's a question. And so I want to be curious to see what are the responses there. All right, so we see lots of people saying A, which is to say that yes, if you had a sibling, a brother or sister, they played with you, they were fun. but only till the teenage years. Many of you are saying that, yeah, after a while, you didn't really see them much. But most of you are actually saying that, yeah, it was fun to have brothers and sisters, and they helped you do the chores. So no problem. Okay, excellent. All right. So A and C, A and B. They were too old with the age gap. That's what Samantha is saying. All right, almost 12 years gap. Okay, no problem, Samantha. Amila is saying a lot of fighting happening most of the time. Muhammad saying no, brother, sister, no problem, Muhammad. Maybe you can think of a cousin or someone else if you have where you could relate this. So excellent. So no problem with that. Now, quick question: when you think about these questions, what do they tell you about your generations, right? So just type in whatever that may come to your mind, right? So I asked you what was your favorite drink. I asked you what did you want to become. I asked you what was the first thing you wanted to buy when you grew up. I asked you about your brothers and sisters, right? So when you think about these questions, what do you think they tell you about your generation? And you can keep a quick 1 or 2 word response in the chat. And we're seeing chats coming live again. And just to see, okay, it's less complicated. Life was simple. All right. Chandimal is saying, yes, that I'm feeling old. All right. So again, good old days, right? More fun, simple life. Yeah, more fun, simple life. Excellent. Happy and content, Zenith says. Absolutely. And that's the range of response that we get. Okay. Simple and fun, less complicated. Everyone more or less wanted the same things. Yeah, correct. It was cool. Life was very cool. Life was happy. All right. So, wow. So again, the idea of this was to take you back in time to look at your childhood and hopefully appreciate that, okay, you grew up in one era, someone else grew up in another era, and they all saw and experienced it slightly differently, right? And that was the point of that fun little kind of a trivia question. Now, here's what we want to do. We want to take the next maybe 30, 40 minutes to help you first understand, we'll understand the generations, we'll understand what motivates each generation. We'll talk then specifically about Gen Z and what are some of our engagement and leadership strategies. All right, so here we go. Okay, why is it important to understand the generations? Well, it is important because what happens to you in your early formative years shapes the way in which you take yourself outside to the corporate world, to the business world, to the education that you can see, and all your different experiences, right? So your formative years have a huge impact on each one of us, right? And of course, they can change, but each one of us can think of a set of things that were happening when we were growing up, right? So first things first, to help you understand just the basic definition of all the generations, right? So there are in all 5 that we can think of. There is the silent generation, which is the generation even before baby boomers, right? And so these are the people who were basically born 1928 to 1945. So that's when the World War II ended. So, many of them would have been born either at the beginning of the end of World War I and also just around World War II. Baby boomer was a generation that starts after World War II, right? 46 to 64, 65 to 80 is the Gen X generation. 81 to 96 is the millennial generation, or Gen Y, often also called as Gen Y. And of course, last one is the Gen Z, which is 97 to 2012. Now, keep in mind, some literature will say they're born between 96 and 2012. Some will say 97 and 2012. You will see some variation only, but by about a year or so. So if we think about this definition, by this definition, and there's a body called the Pew Research Center, which is basically kind of one body which looks at and studies generation. As per that definition, the oldest of the Gen Z would be roughly 24 years. So the oldest Gen Z would be 24 years in age. All right, just so and I'm going to request someone who's talking to just make sure that we be muted, or Hasini, if I can request you to mute everybody, just the participants, please. Okay, so what is a generation? Very quickly, generation is nothing but, an entire body or group of individuals born at a certain time, right? It's nothing but a set of common experiences that we can think of, which shapes our values, which shapes our worldview, right? And there could be a set of historical events. It could be different for each one of us. It could be different for you in Sri Lanka, for me here in India, for someone here in the other part of Asia or Europe or US, wherever you are, right? And so that's what we call simply as the generation. Now, why is it important to know, and how can we understand what these generations are, right? So the first thing we're going to look at is to say that, okay, what was the events that shaped each one of these generations? Now, keep in mind, this is a very important slide because it kind of sets the context of our entire presentation. Now, for the purpose of this particular webinar, I've only taken some key events. Some of them are maybe more with a Western lens, but each one of us can look and kind of apply to say, what was happening in my world, right? So if you grew up in Sri Lanka, what did it mean for you, right, before the independence? If I grew up here in India, what did it mean for me before independence and the British rule, right? But at whole, around the world, what were some of the events? Now, why is this important? This is extremely important for us to understand, because what the events happen essentially kind of drives the context in which people grew up and their behavior in that generation and to the next generation, right? So for instance, the silent generation on the very left, if you look at this and you can see my mouse, was a generation just coming out of World War II. So they had seen the Great Depression, and around the world, basically there wasn't, people were just coming out of the Second World War. If you're coming out of the Second World War, right? If you were a parent from that time, right, your children, your focus was to make sure that there's economic development of the country, of your kids. Families were small at that time, and of course, what does it mean for the next generation? So if you think about from the silent to the baby boomer generation, the baby boomer generation was a generation who basically grew after the World War II, which means that more people were now focusing on growing families, on having a larger family, paying attention to that growth, right? And what were some of the events? So we had the Vietnam War, the moon landing, and so on and so forth. So that's what was happening from baby boomer. Now, from there, we shift to what we call as Gen X and Gen Y. So Gen X, again, many things that people can kind of think through, the Berlin Wall. It was also the time when there was a rise of divorce more generally, right? There is a term called the latchkey kids, because Gen X, which basically means 1965 to 1980, was a time when the parents, or if you can think back, if you were working in that time, and I can tell you that I am a Gen Xer, and so my father was always kind of busy with his work. Of course, my mother wasn't doing a full-time job, but a lot of what the kids who grew up in there is called the latchkey kids, which means that parents were away and the kids were sort of, by themselves in some sense, right? So that you think about more generally the Gen X world. And then, of course, I think many of you, we can all relate to Gen Y and Gen Z. So Gen Y is when the internet actually kind of sprung up. And this is the first generation who took internet to themselves and was very happy revealing who they were, right? And so technology was taking a huge leap in those years. So this is between 1980 and 1995. And from there, we go to the Gen Z context, right? Now, it doesn't matter where you were born, doesn't matter if you're in Sri Lanka or in India or Southeast Asia or any other part, right? There were some events, and there are some events, if you think about the Gen Z profile, they all can relate to that, right? You as a Gen Z in any part of the world can agree to the fact that social media has become very active, right? So, I have a son, I have a nephew, they're well versed with social media. It doesn't matter that I'm here. I have cousins who are in other part of the world, but they're also free, right? So social media was something that was very prevalent. This is also a generation which was seeing things like climate change, right? So for instance, all the debate about, water levels rising and pollution happening and energy crisis. And that's something that kids from that generation or people from that generation will be able to relate it, right? You don't need to hear an expert from Europe or somewhere else, right? When we travel, we see the impact of that, right? Even in our own neighborhoods, in our region and so on. And this is also a generation that was basically is getting and growing into things like fake news, the Me Too movement, and now, of course, the COVID-19. So if you think about the Gen Z context, this is a generation growing in among all things. What does it mean when they go from their world into the workplace, right? So that's what we'll try and explore, right? Now, so if this was the context in which the different generations were growing up, some of the key events, why is it important? It's important because our experience and our values are nothing but what are the foundation for our beliefs, right? So the fact that, if I grow up in a certain time and I see something that's shaping my worldview, and our beliefs is what we kind of carry and fuel our behavior. So that's what we bring to work. So when you think about this as a sort of a backdrop of why we behave the way we do, right? In its core sense. Now we'll all change as things around change, right? Now, here is a slide I want you to pay very close attention, right? Which is to say that if we knew the context in which each of these generations were born and the events, what does it mean for them when you think about in the workplace, right? So if I'm a baby boomer, I'm basically growing after World War II, right? I really had to work hard to kind of, stand on my own 2 feet, to really kind of get independent financially, to make sure that their kids, my kids, if I am a baby boomer, have a good life, right? So what is their value? Hard work, regard for a hierarchy. There's a lot of loyalty, right? You don't see the opportunities that are there now for this generation in streams of work and so on. And so what does it mean for them at work? Well, they are a generation which respects authority. They are a generation which will look at formal processes. They like to be appreciated. So if you are a Gen Y or a Gen X or a Gen Z, and if you have a baby boomer, this is the context you got to keep in mind, right? Their value and what's important to them at work. Similarly, if you look at Gen X, it's about being self-reliance, right? Production over tenure, and what matters to the Gen X, it values to them that they see personal connection, work-life balance, honest and direct communication. And now let's focus on the two generations that everyone wants to talk more about, Gen Y and Gen Z. Now, there's a fine distinction. People always sort of say that, well, they're all the same. No, there's a lot of similarities between Gen Y and Gen Z, but there's a very clear kind of a set of attributes which is different for each generation. So Gen Y, or the millennials, is the generation which was the first tech-savvy generation. This was the generation who was very willing to open their life in the public domain, right? So share it on the Facebook, share it in other mediums, right? Where they are willing to share what they do, what the family does, and so on, right? And what do they want? So they're looking for basically a lot of engagement, right? Because technology was something very close to them. And so they want to make sure when they're in the work, they want to be continuously involved. They want to contribute, right? They want to get feedback. And then from there, if you go from Gen Y to Gen Z, they are absolutely the true digital natives, right? Now, what is the fine distinction? Gen Z prefers privacy as opposed to Gen Y. And this may, some may agree, some may disagree, but a lot has happened in kind of the online world for the Gen Z, right? A lot of cyberbullying that's happening, and that's shaping the way they see online world versus Gen Y, right? And so they respect privacy. They are much more entrepreneurial because of what they're seeing, all the innovations that we're seeing now in our part of the world, right? Asia, which is leading, kind of becoming the engine of all the newer things. And so very realistic, very entrepreneurial. And what would they want? They want autonomy. They want to make sure that they get frequent feedback. And of course, they want to get good diversity of assignments. So We'll understand some of this in some detail shortly, but this is just to give you an idea of, each generation's work value and what does it mean at work. Now, why is it important for us to understand a multi-generation impact of that at work? Well, the impact of this is very real. First thing, if you're not careful, there is going to be a tangible work conflict if a multi-generational workforce is not managed properly. Well, in how so? Well, first, there's going to be a lot of hard costs. A lot of people leave when they cannot get along with bosses, right? When you have a conflict with a boss who doesn't understand you, then this current generation is just going to say, hey, that's it. Unlike the previous generations, who are much more patient, who are much more willing to spend time with a firm for a longer duration, or even retire from one firm. Not the case anymore. Gen Y, Gen Z is saying, look, I'm sorry, we don't get along. I don't see, and therefore you'll see things like turnover. You'll see things like absenteeism, right? You'll see that can lead to productivity. In some markets, because of all of that, there's a legal cost, right? So there's some tangible hard costs. And every time a company has someone who leaves, it really costs them quite significantly because you have to rehire, you have to retrain and all of that. And of course, there is another impact, which is that of damage to your corporate brand, the fact that customer service can suffer, innovation can suffer, morale can be low, and so on, right? So the fact that there is a multi-generation workforce out there, if you don't understand it properly, it does have a real impact, okay? And you will probably thinking, well, how so? Well, just take a look, and I'm giving you this as an example, but I worked with companies here where we've seen that, you could have one workforce and over time, you can see that as that workforce matures, what does it mean for you, right? And so if you look at this as an example, strictly as an example, you can see that on the left, 50% of the workforce currently is made up of a baby boomer profile, right? You got 35%, which are Gen X, and then the remaining are made up of basically Gen Y, Gen Z, and the traditionalists. In other words, very small percentage is the Gen Y, Gen Z, right? Gen Y is there, but Gen Z is even smaller. Now, if you think, and just take that as an example, right? The baby boomer generation, most of them are many of them are probably retired, but even if you see some in the workforce, the chances are that the runway ahead of them is much smaller than the Gen Y or the Gen Z, right? Of course. So if you think that as an example, 5 years out, what could happen, right? You see the whole big chunk coming into the yellow, which is the millennial. Now that's probably already happening now, right? And you see a large chunk of Gen Z. Okay, and a shrinking pool of the baby boomer and the Gen X, right? Now, on this particular one, I'm showing that it's more Gen Y, and of course, Gen Z has grown. But if I were to take this out even further, let's say in 7-8 years, even the millennial population is going to go down, because by the time the millennial population would be in their late 40s or early 50s, right? So what does that mean? It simply means that you have a workforce which is going from one generation, which is predominantly in the system, to another generation, which is in another system. So in this particular example, if you have recent millennials and recent Gen Zs, what does that mean? It means that you have 55% of or 70% of your total workforce, which is closer to, which someone has very little experience. 5 to 8 years of experience, right? So it becomes very, very important for us to make sure that how we learn and how we manage, right? So I'll pause here just to give you the context of our webinar. Now we'll get into understanding Gen Z a little deeper, right? So far what we've done is talk about the generations, talk about the events that have shaped the generations. What does it mean for them at workplace? And does it have a serious impact? It absolutely does, right? So we saw the hard cost, we saw the soft cost, and we look at this example, we can say that, this is quite real. So even you are a recruiting manager, or if you are an HR manager, just think about, what your company demographics going to look like in the next 10, 20 years, right? This pie on the right will be predominantly Gen Z, and then maybe another generation that's coming, which is what we call Gen Alpha, right? So even the millennial generation is going to shrink. So so if you can think about the oldest of the Gen Z is only 24, and the average working age goes till 55 or 60, you're looking at next 35 years of how the Gen Zs will be in the workforce, right? So it's a big runway ahead of them, and a large part of our workforce would be with Gen Zs, and of course some Gen X and Gen Y. Okay, now let's set some context of Gen Z and what does it mean for them if you are an employer. Now, before I go into kind of telling what you should do or what is a Gen Z expecting, let's set the context. If the oldest of the Gen Z is currently around 23, 24, they do not have too much work experience. Look at their background and their history. On a whole, whether it's Asia or Europe or some other part of the world, there's research that says that people who start working, even if you were a teenager, has been steadily been declining, right? So right from the early or late 70s, the teenagers who were at workforce was about 40%, then it's going down in subsequent years, then it's going down, which means lesser Gen Zs have actually worked, but they actually have a view of what work life should be, okay? Now, one of the reasons why they're working less possibly also is because they're living in an economic time which is much more better than what the previous generations were, right? So they're seeing more wealth. They're seeing that the parents have done well. And of course, they want to get into competitive colleges around the world. And so that's taking away time, right? A lot of the entry-level jobs that you may see in our part of the world could also be taken by slightly elderly folks. So all of that simply means that, you have a workforce which is coming into, a professional world, but doesn't have really a lot of experience, right? And they have their own sort of worldview. So many of the Gen Zs are carrying a very unrealistic expectation of the corporate world, right? Saying that, look, the job has to be a certain way, the boss has to be a certain way. And therefore, they get disillusioned very, very quickly, right? So there is data that suggests that more Gen Zs quit jobs than they stay at jobs, right? And again, because they don't have experience, so they have to be almost experience that, okay, what's the corporate world like? Now, if that being true, what can you do if you are the employer, right? So we're gonna look at that as the next 10, 15 minutes. So the first thing I'll say is that for Gen Z, the number one thing is being respected, right? Nothing would be more off to them when their own perception of how they're being viewed and respected, is sort of not in line, right? So it means that they're willing to do things, but provided someone is listening to them, right? So if you're an employer, on a whole, like the first thing that if I'm entering a workforce, I really want to make sure that I am giving them a very realistic picture of what they're going to get into. If I'm a boss, the first thing I have to do is tell them exactly the work hours, okay, the travel conditions, the amount of hours, right? What is the realistic expectation of sort of that growth career? If you don't convey this, you will see the mismatch and you will see Gen Zs going away. So beyond all of that, the thing that you need to do is give them a culture in which they flourish, right? So what does that mean? It means that if I am a Gen Z and if you are an organization, are my values aligning with the ones with the organization, right? This is a generation which is very clear about some of those things. Are my leaders living up to the value, right, of the organization? And am I being regularly updated, right? This is a generation which looks at everything on a device. So if you don't share, if information is not coming through, they cannot resonate. So if you are a team leader of a Gen Z, what does it mean? And if you're a Gen Z coming into an environment where you have to report into someone, he or she is going to say, look, does my manager support me and set me up for success? Okay, do I get enough opportunities to engage and collaborate with my colleagues, right? Am I involved in the decision-making process, right? And of course, if if you're the employee, you want to make sure that you bring, what best yourself to work. Is my work meaningful, and do I have enough opportunities, right? So we're talking about individual, team, organization alignment as one way to make sure that Gen Zs have a very realistic picture of what they can expect. And when we talk about culture, I've just shown you a simple kind of a 2x2. You have actions and behaviors on one side, beliefs and values on the other side, right? So are your actions and behaviors aligned to your values, or are they misaligned? Are your beliefs and values aligned? Are they implicit or explicit, right? So if I'm an organization, if I'm a manager, I want to be able to very clearly say what are the beliefs and values. I can explicitly tell them, or I implicitly tell them. In other words, I don't tell them, I let them figure it out. And if I'm a boss, are my actions aligned with the beliefs and values that I'm saying that I should have for my company, for my team, right? So if you have an implicit and aligned, then that's pretty good. Well, it's a surprise. If the values are implicit but misaligned, you have an opportunity to fix that, right? If your beliefs and values are explicit and they're aligned, that's the best place to be, right? You've got your values and beliefs to be told, and they're aligned, and that means you're authentic. And of course, if you have told the values and belief, but they're still not aligned, then there is a dissonance, right? This is not a good place to be, so you have to fix that. All right, so my question to each one of you is, which one of these do you think represents your company? And you can put this in the chat. Are your beliefs and values aligned? Or so is there a surprise, or is there an opportunity? Is there a dissonance, or is an authentic culture at work? So go ahead and put the number in the chat to tell me, where do you see your company culture when it comes to recruiting the Gen Zs, right? In other words, your beliefs and values, your actions and behaviors are aligned or not aligned, all right? And we're seeing slowly but surely responses coming into the chat. 2, 4, which means there's an opportunity. 4 says, yeah, there is authentic culture. So that's fabulous. Most of you are saying that there is an opportunity, which means that your beliefs and values have not been told and they're somewhat misaligned, right? So something for you to think about, right? And I'm seeing a consistent 2 and a 4, only 2 and a 4. There isn't a 1. So the 4 is very good, which means it's authentic, right? 2 means there's an opportunity, right? So there isn't 1 or 3. So in many ways, the 2 means that you need to kind of take a look at that. All right, thank you for that. Now, very quickly, at the beginning of the webinar, you must have seen a video in which we saw that the 4th industrial revolution is there, and so on. And so we have to think about, as managers who are going to recruit Gen Z, what does it mean, right? So if you think about on the left-hand side, the 1st industrial revolution, the 2nd industrial revolution, the 3rd industrial revolution, the 4th industrial revolution, and what does it mean for the talent, right? So if I was in the 1st industrial revolution, the talent was expected to have physical labor, basic engineering skills, right? You learn the skills and that's it. In the 2nd industrial revolution, right, it was more about standardization, right? So, mass production of cars, mass production of other products, and that's what was the focus. In the 3rd industrial revolution, what we're expecting was deep expertise on something, right? Science, technology, you're talking about mathematics and so on, right? But now we're into the 4th industrial revolution where you're building on that, which is, the cyber physical systems, Internet of Things, right? Which means that you need to not only have that deep expertise, but you need to have learning agility, which means that the world is changing so fast, right? If you think about the pandemic, nobody planned for it. Everyone has to work remotely. Everyone had to really adjust. So learning agility means we all have to quickly learn new things when we don't know, adapt to it, and we need to have a slightly different focus. So even if you are a healthcare professional, how do you answer questions for COVID-19? Like, what's going to be the cost of the vaccine? How will I get the vaccines out? Who gets the vaccines first? What's the communication for vaccines, right? So this is not just the job of a pharmaceutical graduate. You need to have all other perspectives, right? Now, if you think about the talent in the old world, here is what we were expecting. This is a very important slide. pay close attention, right? So why I say is most of us, if you think about the baby boomer generation and perhaps even Gen X, right? The way some of us were brought up to say that life is basically broken into three parts. You have an education band, which is basically till the age 18 or 22, where you study in education. And the next block is your career, basically from 22 to 65, okay, that you just keep in a career. And then in around 66 or more, you look for that one nice pension job or you retire, right? So that's the paradigm of talent in kind of the old economy. Not anymore. And at the time when what was mattering was just your skills and knowledge. Now that has changed. And by what do I mean by that? It has changed from the fact that the way we're going to keep our employees to ourselves is learning, and engagement. The entire model of keeping talent is now focusing on learning. And when we think about Gen Z, this is even more important because Gen Z is coming from a fairly protected generation, right? So many of the parents are not rushing the Gen Z to grow quickly, right? Which means that they are failing less, right? And therefore they have a fixed mindset. And therefore, if you're a boss, one of the jobs we have to do is to help them and continuously keep giving things in which they'll learn new things, right? It's a generation which is inexperienced. It's a generation which has come under a lot of kind of a safety culture. So they don't know a lot of things. So the one way we want them to grow is to keep learning at the core and keep them engaged, right? So this is the flipped model, right? And of course, our life expectancy has also grown significantly, right? It's no more at 65 people are living in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s, right? So you're going to be working more as well. And the things that will be critical here are learning agility, adaptability, and so on, right? So if you are a company, you want to make sure you have an organization that's a learning organization, which means that, you have a clear vision of learning in the system, right? So the organization is set up to show learning, not just, do one-off program, right? Really make learning as a core. So even if it's a good economy, bad economy, learning always happens. The people in the system have to really see learning as a way to grow each other, right? And so that's what we say. Third is knowledge systems, right? Just think about companies where baby boomers are going away. A whole lot of the tacit knowledge is going away. So, right, this is where we use technology to make sure that do we have knowledge management systems in which learning kind of remains in the company? And of course, the role of technology in bringing everything together. Now, how can you do that for a Gen Z? Well, one thing is by giving them coaching by managers. Another thing you can do for Gen Zs is to make sure that they get a chance to attend cross-functional meetings. The third thing you can do is to make sure that you, of course, give them insight on classroom trainings, right? And the last, of course, is the last two is what, on-demand learning through the MOOCs. So basically, your Coursera's, all the free material that we can all kind of get. And of course, then you can look at as they grow and mature, stretch goals and assignment, right? So this is a way to think about how we can keep learning. Another thing to keep in mind is how do you set up yourself physically? So I want to share with you a quick picture of, this is the office of the GSK, the GlaxoSmithKline office in one of their South American countries. And just look at the way they built the office. And why I want to share is that the way you design your physical office also brings engagement into the workforce, right? So you can see on here, there's a quiet zone where people can sit and work. You can see the tables are designed at an angle where you have a greater interaction, right? You can see, of course, there is a ad hoc meeting room. There is a cul-de-sac where you have those relaxed sofas and things like that. There is, of course, a cafeteria. There's a shared workstation, right? So more people can come and meet and work. There's a quiet room again. There are lockers. There's a reception and security. Now, why is that important? Because if you are a manager and if you are designing, you have to keep in mind all the hard aspects and soft aspects, right? So do you keep an open office? Do you keep a closed office? Do you want quiet zones, right? Do you want a cafeteria? Do you want conference rooms? Now, most of us in companies, we'll have our basic structure, but if you really want to kind of think about how can I take this a step further and make the engagement happen, think about these aspects, right? What are the technology tools like the group wikis, blogs, the virtual communities, group chats, SharePoint, right? And if you have those, that's another way in which you can engage this generation. Okay, as I mentioned, that's the role of kind of the corporate or the organization at large. We're going to talk about two quick things and then I'll open up for questions. First is what I call psychological safety for Gen Z, right? It is extremely important. So Google is one company which has been ranked consistently as one of the best places to work for 10 years. And this is what they look for in the managers as the behaviors. One of the things that they look for, and 7 of those are basically skills which are, the soft skills, right? Now, when they were trying to figure out that what does it take for us to create a very high performing team, they had a hypothesis that says that if we want to create a very good working team and with people from different backgrounds, we need to have smart people, we need to have good personalities, and that's the hypothesis they had. But that's their hypothesis. So they being a company with a lot of data, they actually went and did this experiment called Aristotle. And when they did that, what they found out is that they looked at 180 teams for 2 years and they found out 5 kind of levers of what makes a high performance team. And the number one thing that they found out is what is called psychological safety. In other words, teams which are really high performing, the number one thing that they're looking for is just the empathy and this opportunity to hear each other. You don't have to have a high IQ. You don't even have to have the same personality. And so as long as the boss is giving everybody in the team to speak up, to hear him, to hear her, that's good enough. And that's the critical lever to make sure that, teams contribute. And that's what drives innovation, right? If you can open up and create an environment and people can start contributing, that becomes your lever to innovation, right? All right, and when I say that, psychological safety, I'm really not saying that psychological safety doesn't mean that you cannot question. You can question people, right? But you have to feel safe to be vulnerable, right? In other words, if I don't know something, I just tell to say that, look, this is something I don't know, and you're not going to be chastised or reprimanded for that, right? You're safe to ask things. You have to be felt included without the fear of being embarrassed or punished in some way, right? And that's a very important thing that you have to create for the Gen Z, because they're coming from a very protective culture. So you have to create that psychological safety, right? And you can look at this 2 by 2. On the left-hand side, you have psychological safety, which is low and high. On the right-hand side, you have the performance pressure, right? So if you have low psychological safety and a very low performance pressure, well, that's just an apathy zone. It's not a good place to be. If you have high psychological safety, in other words, everybody's looking after each other, but there's no accountability, then that's okay. I mean, that's a comfort zone, what I would call. And the third, which most of us would have experienced at some point in our career, is that there is low psychological safety, right? In other words, my boss is not going to protect me, but he expects a lot out of me, right? There's a high accountability, which is what we call as anxiety zone, right? And the fourth, of course, is you have high psychological safety and high accountability. When you have these two, that's when you're learning, right? So look at that. Now, I want to ask you a question for each one of you. Does your opinion matter at work? What's the answer? And again, please be very honest, right? So for a Gen X, for a Gen Y, for a Gen Z, does it matter? If you say yes, and say agree. If you strongly agree, say 5. So you can put the numbers in the, and let me see what we get here. The chat is again going, oh, okay, let's see. A lot of you are saying 3, 4, 5. So many of you are not sure. Most of you are saying it's a 4. A lot of you are saying it's a 5. So that's great. Hopefully, I mean, that just means that, look, your voice is heard and you are able to make that impact. So very happy to see that. Okay, last but not least is to say that, okay, what is my role as the boss, right? How do I make sure that I communicate exactly to motivate a Gen Z. So if you think about your own, first thing you need to do is to understand your own story, right? So if I'm a boss, like what generation I am, right? So in my case, I'm a Gen X. So I just need to be aware of what was my own context, right? Which was the time in which I grew up, what influenced my thinking. Then I also need to know what was the context of my parents, right? In my case, it was the baby boomer parents, right? Then I also need to know if I have a brother or sister, are they also the same generation or this slightly different generation, right? So in my case, I'm Gen X, right? But I have a brother who's not Gen X, he's Gen Y. Then you got to look at your context of, okay, what about the spouse? Gen X, Gen Y, what is it, right? So again, the more you know your own context in which you're operating, it helps you to see how you take yourself to the Gen Z, right? And if you're working, whom do you normally work with, right? Are you mostly surrounded by Gen Xers, Gen Ys, or Gen Zs, right? Because each of these things are very important. Unless you're aware of the world in which you are in and the world that's shaped you, you're not going to be able to communicate better with the Gen Z, right? So who's your boss? Is he a Gen X? Is he a Gen Y? Or is he a baby boomer, right? So I just give this as an example. Understand your own generation, the parents, siblings, spouse, work, and boss, because that sets the context. Now, for instance, why is that important? Because everything that happens in your generation, you have a very unique way of doing things, right? So your idea of conflict is very different. Your idea of communication is very different. Your idea of learning is very different. And your idea of rewards and recognition is also very different, right? So what motivates me is not what would motivate, let's say, a Gen Y or Gen Z, right? And I just put some, for instance, example, like there are some tools in which we can say that, okay, you can find out what your predominant communication style versus the Gen Ys versus the Gen Zs. What is your conflict style versus the Gen Ys and the Gen Zs? What's your learning style? Because I guarantee you it will be very different. So the first thing is to know your own story well. How do you operate? And once you know that, only then you'll get a chance to figure out that what can you do to lead the Gen Z better, right? And the most important thing is the rewards, right? Are you looking for a higher paycheck? Are you looking for a job which gives you better chance to communicate, contribute, and so on, right? So each one of us get motivated slightly differently. So if I have to say, if I'm a boss, there are 3 things to keep in mind. Know thyself, know your own style, know others, know everyone's story. Keep in mind, all the generations stereotypes are very, very exaggerated, right? So you need to stop, reflect, and you need to rewire. So know yourself, know others, and reflect and rewire. I'm going to leave you with one more thing, which is to say that if you think about, if you want to attract Gen Zs, you have to re-look at the entire employee value proposition, right? So it's no more just giving them the basics and the hygiene factors, but really figuring out what are some of the intrinsic, not just a good paycheck, like what else does it motivate them? Understand that intrinsic factors. What are the motivational factors? You're not recruiting them for jobs. You're recruiting them to give them experiences, right? So, I always tell a story that I met a partner at a Big Four accounting firm, and he says that, what, in Asia, we don't really grow people by skills, we grow them by titles. So a lot of what this generation is also not looking for that, okay, tell me if I'm going to be a vice president in 20 years, but they want like small changes happening in their careers very frequently. So 6 months, 9 months, year, 2 years, right? So that's why you'll see a lot of the employers will actually, they will promote a Gen Z, even though the job itself may not have been very, very different, right? So if I'm an analyst and I've been told I'm now a senior analyst, I have to make sure that they at least get a new title, right? You don't want someone who just going to learn something at the job, which is divergent learning, but you want something which will be very different, which is lifelong learning and convergent learning. And finally, you want to create a time in which you can make sure that there is room for their passion, their fulfillment, and meaning. Okay. So I have said a lot. I know we've just touched the 1 hour. I'm going to say my final slide. You can really harness the generational power. And I just leave this as sort of my final 1 or 2 slide, which is to say that every generation wants to kind of, contribute. So if you think about generation baby boomer, they want to give experience, they want to get valued, and they want to gain excellence. Gen X wants to give service, they want to get recognized, and they want focus. Gen Y wants to give opinions, they want action and engagement. Gen Z wants to give ideas, feedback, and innovation. All right. So I'll leave you with that. I know I've spoken a lot and it's been rushed. One last thing, which is for you to think about, what are you seeing as some of the generational preferences? Are you seeing that are you struggling with attracting and retaining? Are you kind of struggling with talent and engagement? Are you struggling with creating a culture or engagement? So go ahead and put, where do you see the most impact of the generational preferences? Is it 1, 2, 3, or 4? So you can go ahead and put that in the chat, and to see that where are you seeing the most amount of generational impact? Is it when you're trying to attract them? Is it when you're trying to create a culture? Is it when you're trying to make sure that there's engagement? What is it? And we're seeing the chat, which is again going 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we're seeing a whole lot of responses, which is that it could be talent, attracting, engagement, and of course also creating authentic culture. So something for you to keep in mind. I'm going to leave you with one last thought as you think about what is it that you will need to start, what is it that you'll need to stop, and what is it that you will need to continue. All right, so just something for you to reflect on. I mean, we don't have the time now to sort of have that conversation, but I just want to leave you to say that what will you start when you think about Gen Z, right? Will you create a learning culture? Will you create a psychological safety, right? Are you going to give them, are you going to be aware of your own style a little more, right? What are you going to continue if you're doing that? And what will you stop, right? Okay, my friends, we're coming at the hour, so I want to pause to give you the time to ask questions. Last but not least, hopefully, if there's some curiosity, you can take a look at this book that I've just published. As I say, a lot of what I've written in the book is about the talent stories that I saw over the last 15 years in my role for clients across Asia. I've certainly wrote stories of me directly as a parent, as I have Gen Z boys. And therefore, if there's more curiosity, you can certainly take a look at the book itself. It's available on Amazon, and you can go to the nearest Amazon store. So thank you very much. I think that concludes my official part of the presentation, but I welcome any questions, and I'll keep it open now. So you can type the questions in the chat, or you can unmute and ask. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And we have a very still large audience, 152 people. So I'll be around. Feel free. You can put your question in the chat. You can unmute and ask whatever is easy for you. But again, in my limited sort of 60 minutes, I wanted to give you a quick bird's eye view of first understanding the different generations, the key events that shape those generations. What does it mean for us at work? What do I need to do as an employer? What do I need to do as a team leader? And what do I need to do directly as a boss, right? So those were sort of the 3 focus points. And hopefully you have some new ideas and tips as you think about managing Generation Z. As I say, of course, there's more in the book. It's very reasonably priced. Take a look, and hopefully you can find some more tips in there.
Hello, Nikhil. I have a question.
Go ahead. I see a question in the chat, but I also see someone unmuted. So I'm wondering, go ahead. Yes.
All right. First of all, it was an excellent session. We got a lot of information. So just one thing,
Sure.
What would your advice be to a person from Generation Z to be more adaptable and to, face the circumstances that are conflicting with other generations? So what would be your advice to Generation Z?
Yeah, no, excellent question. I think, this is a generation Chaminda, where we see it's, again, as I say, it's a very protected generation. There is, I think the amount of patience that is expected from this generation it's less because of they're surrounded by, I mean, everything for them happens on this device, right? So if something doesn't get, they go to Google as their sort of go-to. So I think as a manager, as a boss, or as a company, being aware that there is kind of a learning curve for this generation, because you have a generation which has grown in a time where they want everything here and now. You also have a generation which is very inexperienced. They haven't worked a whole lot, right? So their own ideas of work is something that's just in their head, right? So I see my son, he says, oh, I'm going to just do this, and I'm going to now, buy a company, and I'm going to, but the reality is it takes, success. It requires you to do many, I mean, it's a slow journey, right? So as employers, the advice that I would say is that we need to have a very real conversation with them when we're bringing inside the company. So the word that I use is that we need to be aware of the psychological contract between the employer and the employee. In other words, what will be the work like? What are the work hours like? What's the progress path like, right? What's going to be the opportunities like? What's going to be the learning like? Now, this is not to say that it doesn't happen, but a lot of this needs to be explicitly be experienced for them when they're onboarding, right? And I think if we can do that, then there is, it's almost like, I think the manager needs to take the onus a bit more, Chaminda, in this case, because here's a generation with that it's grooming in. A lot of what we say about this generation and other generation, that they're narcissistic and they're very self-centered and things like that, that's a function of the age, right? If you're young and a teenager, we all can look back and say we all wanted to try new things and do something stupid, right? But they will probably become a little more stable with the experiences of life. So what motivates them is to have that conversation, right? Be very clear of that conversation. I have seen a lot of people come to a job, be there for a year, and then they just leave, right? Because so the boss needs to be very clear about that. And we did a interaction, Chaminda, on one of our clients where we had the bosses with about 25, 30 years of experience, and we actually got the Gen Zs in a room and having a dialogue. And that dialogue basically said that, on this side, they had an expectation, they want to become a vice president in 5, 10 years. And the boss also had to tell them that, look, that's not possible. At the same time, some of the things that they were saying, which is that the boss weren't doing, which is that, look, I don't want to just talk to you once every year during my appraisal or every 6 months. I want to talk to you very often. I want you to kind of give me directions. I want you to tell me how to do it, right? So I think there's a bit of a give and take from both sides. And I don't know, I hope that sort of answered your question.
Thank you very much, Nikhil. Yes, that did answer my question. Thanks a lot.
Sure. Excellent. And we're seeing many of our friends just thanking us. I want to thank our friends at SLASSCOM, the entire team there, Novan, Shanali, and all the other colleagues who put this together. This is something, as I say, very close to me, deeply passionate. So very happy to kind of be around for a few more minutes.
Nikhil, there's another question. I saw that the Gen Z is looking for feedback for their ideas. How do we need to handle them when we provide feedback?
Yep, absolutely. You're absolutely correct, Gen Z. And I think when it comes to feedback, we need to be, as managers or leaders, first of all, be very open and self-aware of the fact that, are we doing that in the organization, right? So we've done programs around the world. I have led many programs and senior leaders. And when we put them in a simulated environment, they all say, oh yeah, I need to ask feedback. I need to give feedback. So the first question is that actually happening in the system? And we need to be very honest about that, right? It's one thing to talk about it and say about it and practice and preach everyone, but are we doing it? So it takes a lot of, I would say almost practice for the leader to get into a routine of asking feedback and giving feedback. Now, a lot of what companies are doing, and some of the progressive companies, what they're doing is that they're basically getting into this routine of coaching, right? Normally, when you see this idea of coaching up coming into play, let's say 15, 20 years into workforce, and when your senior leader is being groomed for a really big position, then you bring an individual coach, and then you say that, you know what, this leader is struggling with these 3-4 things, and can you help them? But good companies are actually doing the other way now, which is to say that very early in that learning journey, in that career path, they're bringing the idea of coaching. And when I say coaching, coaching is not just external coaching, but internal coaching, right? Which is to say that be very deliberate about a coaching culture, which means the boss is trained in being a good coach. The moment you do that, you can then know how to lead this person, how to give feedback. So my first advice would be, if there's a room for coaching culture, that's great. Also, when I say coaching, it's not just the boss giving coaching to Gen Z, but also the other way. Can you think about reverse mentoring, right? And finally, to the direct question that, okay, if we want to know what's the feedback, then you have to share it. And there's so much now on coaching itself, right? So it's not about always telling them the good and then some bad and then the good. There may be some instances in which you can do it like that, but there may be some other instances where you just need to say, sorry, that, you know, this idea won't go, but give them that freedom, right? Give them that psychological safety. I think that's the most important thing. I think this is a generation which is very keen to contribute, but it is on to the managers to make sure that we create that psychological safety, right? So we all say that, you know, this generation wants to be very innovative. Well, innovation doesn't come if you're going to be slapped every time you make a mistake, right? So we have to create that environment to give them a little bit of freedom to experiment, and that takes good leadership, right? So we have to be clear about that. So give feedback in the instances in which there's good, share that. In instances where it's not so good, share that as well. But overall, create an environment of safety. Okay. Anyone else? All right, so lots of good comments. Thank you all for...
Hi, Nikhil.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. If you take Gen Z, like you said, it's they're more of a inexperienced, so they panic a lot in situations. Example, in office situations, sometimes they can panic a lot. They're more stressful because they're inexperienced. So how do you handle those? Maybe you need to prepare them for those situations, right?
Absolutely. No, excellent question. The way I would say, remember the comment that I made sometimes back, is that it's a generation where their own parents, and I'm not blaming the parents, but I'm just saying that it's a generation in which their parents are allowing them to grow slowly. In other words, they're not in a hurry to make them adults, right? And in that context, they often are protected more, right? And in that context, they're not allowed to try, experiment, fail a little more. And when you become in that environment, you almost kind of inherit a fixed mindset. In other words, what happens is that you become someone who is more focused on performance. You're not willing to reveal your vulnerabilities, right? You're not willing to reveal your mistakes. And so therefore, this is a generation which in some ways have to go from that fixed to the growth mindset, which is basically saying that, look, we want you to explore a journey. We want you to try and not worry as much about the performance. And now it's a little hard. It's easy from a parent's context. From a work context, as I say, you let them know that, look, this is how it will work. You'll be expected to do some things. You'll be expected to give a little bit of freedom, right? In some instances, we'll allow you to do that. In some instances, we won't allow you to do that. And just have a very honest conversation, right? And the more you can create that culture, I think, and you have to find out ways in which you can create that culture, right? So I'll give you an example. In the US, there is a hospital called the Johns Hopkins Hospital. And the Johns Hopkins Hospital, like the #1 or the #2 or #3 hospital for many, many years. And what they've done is that when they try to understand the patient, one of the things that the senior doctors do is ask the patient to say that, are you okay if our junior most person does the diagnostic, right? And this is done deliberately so that the junior most guy gets the experience of trying something and maybe, doing something which may not be always correct. And the patient has to be willing. When the patient gives the consent, the junior most doctor is going to kind of do the diagnostic, and then they will run it through an experienced doctor. And when that happens, that's when the learning comes. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, any last questions? I will have to drop away in another 5 minutes, but it's been an absolute pleasure. I want to thank Nuwan, I want to thank Shonali and the entire team at SLASSCOM to organize this. I know that we only had 60 odd minutes together, so it may have felt rushed, but that's sometimes what we have to deal with on a webinar. But hopefully it's a Friday evening and a Friday afternoon where you can stay back a little extra, and do reach out. If I can answer any questions, reach out to my friend Nuwan or the colleagues at SLASSCOM. Certainly the book is a good guide, and I want to wish each one of you all the very best. So Nuwan, over to you.
Yeah, so I think you covered almost everything you thanked as well. So let me thank all the participants who joined us today on this session, and it was quite interesting as well, and a lot of insights. I think we will be sharing the slide deck with the participants, so you can read more in terms of like applying this into your own organizations. Last not least, thank you very much, Nikhil, for taking your time and putting this effort to deliver this great session. So, and for the audience, we will be having few more sessions coming up around well-being and more contemporary topics around the digital age businesses, and with the pandemic and how businesses could navigate through, and the insights that we could provide. So there will be a series of sessions coming up. So thank you everyone, and it's challenging times working remotely. So the last advice would be stay safe till we meet again. Have a great evening to everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Stay safe. Bye, Nuwan.